Hello. Hello.
Hello, Peter. Hello, Werner. Hello, Mercedes. Hello, Fabiola. Elaine.
Hello, Camila.
Hello, we're now online. So if you can begin.
Okay, then. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Our good evening to all our panelists and also to everyone who is joining us now. It is a pleasure for me to welcome this virtual CS panel entitled The Right to Early Childhood Care and Education in Latin America and the Caribbean in the Context of Global Environmental and Social Challenges. I would like to say, first and foremost, extend our solidarity across the entire world. We are all going through a very difficult moment, and we are grateful that CS has enabled us to keep this activity going. We are taking it forward at the exact same time and day as originally planned. And it just feels good to be able to connect with all of you, and congratulations for maintaining such an important Congress happening. So I would like to remind everybody that this is part of the virtual CIS, and in the chat of Clade, you will be able to find the link that takes us to the calendar, where you will find many other very interesting activities. So we invite all of you to take a look and participate and engage in the next few days and also months, because CIS has expanded the possibility of us holding our events not only in the next couple of days or this week, but during the next couple of months. And we are, CLADE is the Latin American Campaign for the Right to Education. We are holding this event in alliance with OMED and also in alliance with DUCO. We are holding it in English. We have some guests that do not speak Spanish, and we are so honored to have with us. And also we decided to hold it in English so that we could dialogue with not only Latin America, but also with the different continents of the world. And we hope that colleagues from Latin America will bear with us in this sense, reminding everyone that we will be able to, we will summarize the main elements of this conference in Spanish in order to circulate it very broadly across our continent. So with this introduction, I would like to pass the word to Professor Peter Moss from London, and who is joining us. So Professor Peter Moss, if you, the word is with you.
Okay, I understood you were going to show the video I had made.
That is correct. I'm sorry. Yes, because Professor Peter Moss hadn't originally planned. This is a virtual seminar for. This is a virtual seminar that has been planned from the beginning, partly virtual and partly presence. That's the original plan, and actually, Professor Peter Moss had actually intended to make it to be virtual from the very start. So we will show a video, but he is with us, so he will be able to participate during the debate. Thank you, Peter Moss, and Fabiola, over to you so that you can show the video. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My paper today is titled Reimagining Early Childhood at a Time of Epochal Precarity, Asking Political Questions, Telling New Stories. Over the last 40 years, early childhood care and education has become a policy priority in many countries and for many international organizations, including the OECD, UNESCO, World Bank. This rise to priority has coincided with the establishment of the global hegemony of neoliberalism, and the two are closely intertwined. This can be seen in particular in a dominant narrative that has driven national and global policymaking in early childhood care and education, a narrative that is instrumental and economistic in rationality and adopts technical practice as first practice. It is a narrative I have termed the story of quality and high returns. In a nutshell, this is a story of how a modest investment at the right stage of human life, early intervention, using effective human technologies will produce high returns later on. A productive and flexible workforce, a competitive economy, and a reduction in a range of social problems. In this way, so the story goes, early childhood care and education will ensure individual and national success in an increasingly cutthroat global marketplace, and everybody lives happily ever after. This story is encapsulated in the title of a report prepared for the UK government: Early Intervention, Smart Investment, Massive Savings. In particular, early childhood care and education has come to be seen as a powerful means, indeed the most efficient means, of maximising human capital. The much cited Heckman curve, named after the Nobel Prize winner James Heckman, purports to show that, quote, the earlier the investment in education, the greater the return, with Heckman himself claiming, and I quote again, that investing in the continuum of learning from birth to age 5 not only impacts each child, but it also strengthens our country's workforce today and prepares future generations to be competitive in the global economy tomorrow. As such, early childhood care and education has been framed as a major contributor to a more general trend in education in recent years, the economic turn, in which enhanced economic performance has become education's main, or indeed only, purpose. In the words of David Labaree, from the global education reform movement to its policy apparatus in the OECD and its policy police in the PISA testing program, we have seen one goal trump the others. Nowadays, the uniform message is human capital über alles. Elsewhere, I've argued that this story of quality and high returns is problematic for a number of reasons, including its implausibility and naivety, with Ed Ziegler, one of the architects of the flagship US early intervention program Head Start, describing the large claims made as believing in magic. Its authoritarian tendency, with the managerial mix of programs and measurements leading to an ever greater governing of children, parents, and educators, and its denial of politics. It is the last of these objections that I want to dwell on. For those who tell the story of quality and high returns, treat early childhood education as first and foremost a technical practice dominated by the technical question, what works? And the accompanying belief that there is one right, expert-derived answer to the question. In this respect, early childhood care and education is no different to education in general. It is one instance of how all education has been reduced to a technocratic model, which, as Gert Beerster puts it, the only relevant research questions are questions about the effectiveness of educational means and techniques, forgetting, among other things, that what counts as effective crucially depends on judgments about what is educationally desirable. This approach reflects neoliberalism's rejection of the political in favor of the technical. It's favoring of means over ends, since the ends under neoliberalism are assumed and not up for discussion. There are, as Margaret Thatcher often commented, no alternatives. All that matters is to identify the correct human technologies to implement neoliberalism's ends. But I would contend education is first and foremost a political practice. In the words of Loris Malaguzzi, one of the greatest educationalists of the 20th century, education is always a political discourse, whether we know it or not. It is about working with cultural choices, but it clearly also means working with political choices. Repoliticizing education means deliberating upon and making political choices in response to political questions defined by Chantal Mouffe as not mere technical issues to be solved by experts, but questions that always involve decisions which require us to make choices between conflicting alternatives. To which I would add, what marks a political question is also that it bears on matters of public interest and the common good. It is not to deny the importance of technical practice, but to regard such practice as following on from political practice, putting ends before means. What sort of political questions should we be asking about early childhood care and education, or indeed for all education, as I think the important political questions are similar across all sectors? For Malaguzzi, the first such question had to be, what is your image of the child? Arguing that a declaration about the image of the child is not only a necessary act of clarity and correctness, it is the necessary premise for any pedagogical theory and any pedagogical project. And for Malaguzzi, the political choice was clear. We, in Reggio Emilia, he wrote, say all children are rich. There are no poor children. All children, whatever their culture, whatever their lives, are rich, better equipped, more talented, stronger, and more intelligent than we can suppose. The rich child is born with immense, unknowable, and wondrous potentiality, having what Malaguzzi famously described as 100 languages, and making meaning of the world, learning, if you will, from the very beginning of life as a protagonist, an active subject. The rich child, too, is a citizen with rights, those with disabilities being children with special rights rather than poor children with special needs. But there are other important political questions to be asked. What is our diagnosis of the times? What is our image of the early childhood centre or school? And of the educator? What ethics for education? What are the fundamental values of education? What is early childhood education for? What pedagogy? And what do we want for our children here and now and in the future? It seems to me that the first of these questions, what is our diagnosis of the times, must involve a political choice of the converging environmental crises, which together with the nuclear threat has recently led the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists to move its doomsday clock to just 100 seconds before midnight. These environmental crises have been exacerbated by neoliberalism, as have a range of other pressing social conditions, increased inequality and insecurity, and the weakening of democracy, solidarity, and cooperation. Taking some of the other political questions I have suggested and offering the briefest of political choices, the ethics of education must, I believe, include an ethics of care, which encompasses our relationship with ourselves, with others, and with the environment. The fundamental values of education must today include democracy, cooperation and solidarity, as well as interconnectedness and complexity, all essential for building an effective response to the global crises we face. Education must be for a number of purposes: social, political, cultural, and economic, though the economic purposes should be related to the needs of a new, sustainable green economy. And the image of the early childhood centre or school is as a forum or public space where citizens, children and adults can come together to work on projects of common interest and agreed importance, not least addressing the environmental crises and rebuilding democracy, solidarity and cooperation. This is an image of the centre or school that Kerry Facer has proposed when she writes that the school, and I'm quoting here, may be one of the most important institutions we have to help us build a democratic conversation about the future. A physical, local school where community members are encouraged to encounter each other and learn from each other is one of the last public spaces in which we can begin to build the intergenerational solidarity, respect for diversity, and democratic capability needed to ensure fairness in the context of socio-technical change. In a subsequent article written since she became Professor of Climate Change Leadership at Uppsala University, Facer adds that, and I'm quoting again, the public school has the potential to convene publics around the challenge of reducing emissions. A public school in the age of climate change then can bring together its diverse communities to work out the difficult choices and creative possibilities presented by global warming. Facer's work is just one example of what I would call a resistance movement growing to confront and contest neoliberal education reform with its dominant economic narrative. This resistance movement is also apparent and growing in early childhood care and education. For example, the Reconceptualizing Early Childhood Education Group with its annual international conference, and the American Education Research Association's Critical Perspectives on Early Childhood Education Special Interest Group. The many books, for example, the titles in the Contesting Early Childhood or the Critical Cultural Studies of Childhood book series, as well as many academic articles. The growing number of undergraduate and postgraduate courses that introduce alternative stories to their students, and doctoral theses undertaken by students who are attracted by these same stories. And networks for those interested in past pedagogical traditions or current pedagogical projects. For example, the many national networks for people interested in Reggio Emilia. Nor should we forget the growing resistance among indigenous groups and in countries outside the Anglosphere, such as in Latin America. For the story of quality and high returns has emanated from the English-speaking world and spread through the English language. The environmental campaigner George Monbiot has argued that, and I'm quoting again, stories are the means by which we navigate the world, and the only thing that can displace a story is a story. What is needed in early childhood care and education, and what is emerging from what I have termed the resistance movement, are new stories that can displace the dominant story of quality and high returns. These new stories can be created from the political choices we make to political questions, combined with a more poetic and a richer vocabulary than typically employed in neoliberal stories. I have offered my own story, what I have termed the story of democracy, experimentation and potentiality. It's based on democracy and experimentation as fundamental values of education and the image of the child and the school as having unknowable and infinite potentialities. But there are many other stories that could be told and which should relate to and reflect the diversity of experiences and the multiplicity of perspectives of individuals, families, and communities. But the creation of new stories about early childhood care and education based on political choices emerging from a democratic politics of education should not take place in isolation. It should be connected to, entangled with, a larger process involving education as a whole, and indeed the struggle for a future that is built on democracy, social justice, solidarity, and sustainability, and education's contribution to that larger future. As Monbiot says, we need many minds from various disciplines: economic, environmental, political, cultural, social, logistical, working collaboratively to create a better way of organizing ourselves that meets our needs without destroying our home, planet Earth. Those of us in the early childhood field need to be able to understand and relate to the transformative ideas emerging in other fields, including economy, democracy, and environment. While those working on those broad subjects need to be aware of what early childhood, indeed all education, could contribute to them. In fact, there are already hopeful signs, for example, around the relationship between early childhood care and education and the development of more environmentally sustainable forms of living. Education for sustainability has emerged in recent years, becoming a global movement, and that movement has included early childhood. Julie Davis and Sue Elliott, in their 2014 edited book, Research in Early Childhood Education for Sustainability, note how the field of early childhood education for sustainability grew out of practitioner networks, mainly in Australia. Since when, the field has developed rapidly, including the establishment of the UNESCO Chair for Early Childhood and Sustainable Development, the organisation of international meetings, and the forming of cross-national networks, and a growing body of research, publications, and teaching resources. As an example of the latter, the Early Childhood Education for Sustainability framework, produced in England, provides a pedagogical toolkit that supports and challenges early years practitioners to understand how they can embed crucial ecological values into their practice. And this desire to commit early childhood care and education to a transformative environmental agenda is also apparent in the field's growing engagement with post-humanism, in which, to quote from a recent book, the central, privileged and autonomous position of human beings, lording it over all else from on high, along with the belief in their superiority and separateness from all else, is superseded. The world is no longer centered on human beings and their affairs. Instead, the place of human beings in the world is decentered, with the focus moving to interdependence within what has been termed more than human worlds, a term that encompasses a wide range of constituents: things, objects, other animals, living beings, organisms, physical forces, spiritual entities, and humans. The term entanglements is often used to convey a sense of the multiplicity, complexity, and inescapability of the relationships involved. From this new post-human perspective, old boundaries, especially those that sustain a distinct and privileged position for human beings have begun to break down and blur, to be replaced by an attention to interdependencies, interconnections, and entanglements. The story of quality and high returns may, for the moment, remain dominant, especially among policymakers and politicians who still cannot see beyond a future of more of the same and are unable to imagine a reconfiguration of the relationship between humans and the earth. But for those of us who choose to listen, other stories are out there now. Stories that tell of how that relationship might be reconfigured and of the role of education in that transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Peter Moss, from the Institute of Education, University College of London, for your brilliant intervention. I would like to remind all of you who have joined a little bit afterwards that we will be having the synthesis of all the interventions in Spanish as well, and we will be subtitling in Spanish the intervention of Professor Peter Moss. So I would like to, we will leave comments for the very end, and please send through your questions and your comments. We will be doing our best to interact with all of you, all of the audience, and I know that there are many of you already online from different countries of the world, and many from Latin America as well, and other continents. It's really such a pleasure to be virtually all together. Professor Peter Moss, thank you again for putting center stage education as a whole, as a political activity, political in its very nature, and also for reminding us of the importance of this perspective of sustainability, this ecological perspective, as you put it, where really the human being is just a part of a much bigger whole, and we are all interdependent. I think that this also is very timely considering the current crisis we're living of coronavirus. I think that we are all humbled by what is happening, and I'm happy to see that despite terrible reactions from certain governments, including the president of my own country, Brazil, who is shaming us tremendously, but we are also seeing so much solidarity happening and interconnectedness. So I think that this perspective you are sharing with us is extremely timely and makes us all think as well of what is currently happening to all of us as a world. And we'll come back again to the very interesting aspects that you have referred to, Professor. But before that, I would like to call the Mercedes Mayol LaSalle. I am so honored that you are joining us. Mercedes is the president of the World Organization from Early Childhood Education. She comes from, she's from Argentina and joining us from Buenos Aires. So Mercedes, the floor is yours.
To me to share this platform with you, with all you. Well, during 2018, OMEP, CLADE, and EDUCO developed a study to analyze the existing early childhood education policies and legislation in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we tried to contribute with it, identifying achievements and challenges involved in the realization of the human right to education of children from birth to 8. We used for this research the human right-based approach for the analytical work rooted in the international human rights instruments and the 4 features of the right to education: viability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability. And we took 10 countries from the region: Mexico, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Honduras, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, and Colombia. Briefly, I can share with you that we observe, despite the powerful definition of children as holders of rights enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the valuable guidelines on the right to education, there is still a lack of a specific indication on how the human right to education is achieved in early childhood. There are important challenges in terms of the effective implementation of integral and intersectoral approaches of the rights of the child, where the rights to education is a core part, even to determine financing or mechanisms to enforce those rights. If we look to inside the legal framework, we could see that the general education laws in the region recognize education as a human right and a social good, as it was stressed by Peter. Likewise, they underline the state responsibility to ensure the full exercise of the right to education since early childhood, with different baselines. Some countries, such Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, and others, consider the right since birth. And others, like Costa Rica, Honduras, or Mexico, consider it that the child is 3 or 4 years old within, and the others, in other social policies, they have complementary laws for early childhood care since birth. Together with the general education laws, most governments have other laws for the comprehensive protection of the rights of children to health, welfare, education, which means that the general education law coexists with other regulations that contribute to the practices and policies addressing early childhood education and care. This is a characteristic feature of early childhood education and care. It's fragmentation, which is ruled by coexisting norms in different sectors and may present contradictions in terms of approach. This range of norms also present discontinuities in building a system in its governance. It is an obstacle in the coordination between the state and other actors, in the proper use of resources, in the effectiveness and transparency of financing, in the creation of policies that comply with the principle of indivisibility and interdependence of human rights. What about public policies? Well, regarding the public policies, we could see that the proposals are highly diverse in terms of intersectoral and sectoral care, government sectors and levels, different levels, which they depend, the private sector, community, the public administration, different practice orientations, different targets of population, different targets related with age and groups of children, different profile of adults in charge of the work with children, also different geographical environments, different proposals, schedules, sources, etc. Despite social progress and paradigm shift, there are still ambiguities in state diligence, particularly for children less than 3 years old. This usually leads to public policies with partial scope. So in social representations and policy, we could see that there are still arguments, prejudices, and practices linked to all paradigms, as well as overlapping and fragmentation of public policies. Also, there are proposals that are first and foremost educational or more focused on social protection. Sometimes we have holistic ones with an educare approach. Its viability is strongly affected by the fragmentation and the provision based on children's age and social origin. Regarding access and attendance for children aged from 4 to 8, the educational sector has developed a leading role within education systems, and authorizing the private administration of early childhood centers. On the other hand, the education sector offers few centers for children from birth to 3. So this is covered by other public sectors such as social protection or welfare sectors, as well as community initiatives, programs, and of course the market. Despite the enrollment expansion, inequality in terms of access persists because households with high economic level are 30% points above the access values of 5-year-old children from the poorest households. Inequality in terms of access is also confirmed in the huge gap between the access of children over 3 years old and the access of children from birth to 3. Another important aspect to underscore is that the mandatory and for free education is limited. International agreements, particularly the Agenda Education 2030, provide this at least for 1 year before attending primary school, and in many countries of the region, it has been extended to 2 or 3 before primary. However, the private sector has an active role in receiving age groups where education is not mandatory. Therefore, access still highly depends on the economic status of the family that can afford it. That is why early childhood education and care is a privilege for some children, more than a human right for all, particularly from birth up to 3 years old. In terms of viability, in general, there is a significant lack of facilities and works offered, particularly for the youngest. Governments are acknowledging the need to establish regulations to run early childhood education and care services, setting standards for equipment, safety, and building conditions, implementing registration and inspection systems for institutions, particularly for those of the private sector. However, this process is slow, unequal, hindered by insufficient investment. The right to education and care in early childhood also entails the provision of quality service from an holistic and cross-disciplinary approach. Low quality provision usually correlates with initiatives addressing children living in poor conditions. This doubles the injustice because they do not have access to right neither at home nor at the centers, nor at school, while children from the most privileged sectors enjoy a varied provisions. We can also observe that educational practices focus on school readiness from younger age, leading to what we may call primarization in Latin America, primarization. This trend goes hand in hand with an increase of learning measurements based on the application of standardized tests, often promoted by international organizations. One of the key requirements to guarantee quality is to have enough and adequate trained teachers. This is another problem, but we could affirm that there are different certifications requirements and distribution of qualified and unqualified educators between children less than 3 and oldest children. Another characteristic is the feminization of the profession. Based on the acknowledgement of significant progress observed in the region, particularly since the adoption of the convention, we can appreciate the need to continue stressing the relevance and priority that must be given to early childhood education and care in legal, political, budgetary, institutional frameworks, so that they are deeply rooted in the best interest of the child and I would say paramount interest of the child, and grant greater protection to their rights. Based on the guideline principle of this study that acknowledge children as holders of rights and the need to ensure the realization of all the rights enshrined in the Convention, we propose 8 recommendations. I will mention them to end my exposition. One is my presentation. One is public policies aimed at early childhood education and care must be funded on right-based approach and the comprehensive of intersectoral definition of early childhood promoted by the convention, by the CRC. 2, early childhood education and care must be fully available and accessible for all since birth without discrimination. 3, quality is a key dimension for the realization of the right to early childhood education and must lie in the heart of all the programs. 4, the assessment of early childhood education and care programs must respect the characteristics of early childhood years and the education purposes derived for the convention in terms of early childhood. 5, it is important to acknowledge the value of the educators, addressing initial and continuing education, fair pay, and the overcoming gender stereotypes. 6, funds must be foreseen and guaranteed in public budgets sufficiently and consistently with the needs with this educational stage. 7, the consolidation of information and data system is necessary to strengthen, to know what is happening with early childhood, and to implement and follow up policies for early childhood. And the last one, the importance of strengthening effective mechanisms to access to justice, ensuring protection and remedies for violated rights in the region. Thank you, Camila.
Thank you ever so much, Mercedes, for your brilliant intervention. Very holistic, sharing with us all the findings of the study that we carried out, and highlighting in such rich detail the panorama that we have, the context that we have in the Latin America and Caribbean region. I would like to, before passing the word to our next panelist, just remind colleagues that we have the pleasure to be accompanied today by participants from many Latin American countries, and also from Norway, Ireland, Finland, Italy, Ghana, Turkey, the United States, Chipre, among many others. So thank you again for CIS for allowing this possibility of a fully virtual academic meeting. It is so important to have this moment of dialogue and encounter. And thank you everybody who is joining us and sharing with us your presence. Please do feel free to send comments and questions. We will be looking at them and then coming back to them once the panelists are over. Mercedes, thank you so much for everything that you've highlighted. I think that really, it stands out to me, what you mentioned at some point of your presentation, that early childhood care and education is being treated as a privilege much more than a right, and really highlighting an element of the reality that we have in Latin America, but also across so many places, which is the very structural and deep-rooted inequalities that really manifest themselves so much in early childhood care and education, particularly in the early years. And also for highlighting the issue of what in Latin America we call the primarization of education, which is bringing this logic of standardization, of testing, the technical approach, that the depoliticized approach that Professor Butermos mentioned. It goes more and more into early childhood care and education from the most early years. And we have been growingly concerned with the testing that is also starting to happen more and more in early ages. The PISA for very small children. This is something that we really need to problematize, and brings us back to what Peter Moss calls the narrative of quality and high returns. So I would like to call our colleague, Madeleine Zuniga. Madeleine she's from Peru, and she is the coordinator of the Peruvian campaign for the right to education, and she will be sharing with us the national perspective and the issues that really affect early childhood care and education in her country. Welcome, Madeleine. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Camila, and my congratulations to the organizers of CIES for their commitment to go on and hold this panel despite all the problems the whole world is suffering because of the coronavirus. Yes, my intervention would be to show from a national perspective most of what Mercedes has just said, and also, of course, the lines that Professor Moss given us in order to have a very much more political perspective concerning early childhood and education, care and education. I would say that in Peru, the history of early childhood care and education policies have a long story, because the first policies were given in the decade of the 70s of the past century, at the moment where there was an attempt, a very nice attempt to reform drastically our system, to have it more democratic, more achieving equity and equal opportunities for all. Unfortunately, it was a very, very short period because of a military coup took over, and the reform was drastically stopped too. But fortunately, for a long time, really, the policies concerning early childhood care and education were sustained, where the important thing is that they highlight that they were very comprehensive policies, because they had into consideration that early childhood education and care policies should encompass nutrition, hygiene, psychological, cognitive, socio-affective development, and also the importance of play and protection, because they were considered the foundations of an optimal development of every human being from the beginning of his existence. In a way, it was declaring or expressing the right of a human being, since the rights, actually, a series of rights that every human being is entitled of since the very minute of his birth. But we have a very nice example of how these policies were manifested in a special program called Wawawasi, that comes from a Quechua word that means the house of children. They were a real good example of comprehensive programs for Latin America. And as I say again, they lasted for some years, but unfortunately, the constant changes of governments make the impact of national policies regarding the fulfillment of human rights, and in particular the human right to education, to have had stages of progress followed by stagnation, setbacks, and all that, which have really affected the implementation of early childhood care and education policies in the country. Little by little, we might say that the awareness of the importance of a comprehensive child development was abandoned to consider initial education as a preschool stage, a period of just preparing for better performance of children at the primary level. Furthermore, in the 90s, with new reforms under the Millennium Development Goals focused in achieving universal primary education, that really affected the attention to initial education within the educational system, and infants under 3 years of age became almost invisible to the state. They really don't receive any attention whatsoever. Fortunately, at the beginning of this century, and mostly during the second decade of this century, new winds began to refresh memories, and authorities of a new government recognized the great debts in policies addressed to benefit early childhood, and early childhood care and education was again considered a priority for the Ministry of Education. There are undeniable advances in the present decade in terms of coverage of initial education, especially for children between 3 and 5 years of age, and for infants up to 8 years of age, because they are attending the first 2 grades of primary education. We have over 95% of children attending the whole primary schools, and something that we would like to highlight is that there is no gender gap in the attendance of boys and girls to all grades in primary education. Unfortunately, the coverage of education, early childhood care and education programs and services for children under 3 years of age have an immense gap. State services only reach 11% of the population entitled to receive them. Now, giving priority to early childhood education and care policies have faced several problems since 1996 onwards. Some of them, or practically the majority of them, have already been mentioned by Mercedes. I think that the most challenging one is the need to overcome the fragmentation of early childhood by age range. The responsibility of policies addressed to early childhood is divided into 3 ministries in Peru. Children under the age of 3 served by the Ministry of Development and Social Inclusion, it's called. And boys and girls from 3 to 8 of age are over or under the Ministry of Education in their first grades of primary school, attending initial and primary. But a third ministry, the Ministry of Women and Vulnerable Population, is responsible for monitoring the program delivered to this population, because the policies are part of the so-called National Action Plan for Children and Adolescents. We can say there is no clear authority concerning policies addressing infants in the country. However, the constant difficulties to efficiently articulate the services offered by MIDIS and Minedus, the Education Ministry, are beginning to come with a new program led by the Ministry of Social Inclusion called Include to Grow. The novelty of the program is that it is being implemented with a territorial management strategy approved in July 2019, just last year. Involves not only the Ministry of Development and Social Inclusion, plus Education, plus the Ministry of Women, also the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Finances. It counts with an approval of a special budget for the fiscal year 2019 and 2020. The strategy was designed based in the outcomes of a series of research papers on different aspects of child development. The Ministry of Development and Social Inclusion defines the strategy as, and I quote, "It is the intersectoral and intergovernmental coordination strategy that aims to increase access to the integrated package of prioritized services that contribute to the development of girls and boys from gestations to, from birth, actually, when they are in the womb of their mothers until 5 years of age." I must say that this government, the present government, does recognize the infants as subjects of rights, but still the great inequalities that are a constant challenge for the country, we might say that what Mercedes has outlined, and also Camila, that unfortunately early childhood care education is still a privilege and not a right for everybody. If the strategy is maintained, this territorial strategy, and to include to grow, as it says, despite the future political changes, because we now have a new Congress and we are going to have national elections next year, we may have started our way to achieve the necessary intervention and responsibility of several public sectors to deliver better programs of early childhood care and education in the country. But it's all uncertain again. We do hope that the strategy works, and we plan to have a small research actually to monitor how that strategy is really expressed in the policies and programs implemented by a district, a local government. For another great challenge in the country is, of course, inequities. It's the complex, the very, very, really complex diversity of the population of Peru in terms of socioeconomic levels, geographic locations, cultural and ethno-linguistic diversities make inclusion and equity a permanent challenge. That diversity would not be the problem. It shouldn't be the problem, but it is the source of great social inequities. These inequities are easy to identify, not only in access to services, but also in the quality of the services. According to the official figures, gender parity, as I said, in primary education is quite advanced, and is the inclusion, but it is the inclusion of indigenous children in primary school is also quite high. And this is because the policies of bilingual intercultural education that remain as part of the educational policies, despite changes of governments. It has not very good quality. There is a lot of controversy concerning how the bilingual intercultural schools function, but still, at least in terms of access, we must say that the great majority of indigenous children attend primary school from the first grade. But it is not the case at all for the children under 3 years of age. Actually, that so important of every human's life is so much neglected in our countries. There are moments that we can see that there is a concern, a real consciousness about the importance of that stage, but then it is dropped by some other policies. The low coverage of early childhood and education programs for children under 3 years of age is a great misfortune, since many scientific studies, as we know, have proved the importance of the first years of life because of the fast brain development of children at that age and how critical it is to give them the opportunities to interact with their social and physical environment, with the interaction with persons and natures. Becoming more and more conscious in the last years, right? We consider this gap of coverage a misfortune because of the strong socioeconomic stratification of our country and children living in poor and extremely poor conditions in both rural and urban areas, the ones that need more attention, are massively left behind. They may not have the opportunity of early experiences that would help them achieve an optimal development at the stage of their lives. Middle and upper class children at this age may not need special programs for early childhood, right? Because they have the chance of a comprehensive development at home with their peers. There are over 1.5 million infants that need the services and that they don't get them. The lack of opportunities to develop their potentials show in their learning outcomes in primary level. Differences in early development may be evident even in high school. A third challenge is the quality of initial education. Evaluations have shown there is also a great quality gap between initial education centers and services in urban and rural areas, between poor and non-poor groups, between Spanish-speaking communities and those speaking an indigenous mother tongue. The quality of education in preschool services can make a good impact in the future school performance, but social differences are crucial, and studies have proved that if the quality is poor, initiation has no impact in school performance for disadvantaged children. Well, evaluation of early childhood education outcome really have been very, very scarce in the country, very scarce. And I think it was 2 years ago that an evaluation was done, and the outcomes, of course, were very poor. There were very much discrepancy concerning the instruments used for that evaluation. But fortunately, to a certain extent, we cannot talk about standardized evaluation applied to children in childhood education programs. The children around 9 years of old are those that are suffering from standardized evaluation tests. Now, concerning, I think, although quality services demand multi-sectoral plans, and we hope the territorial strategy mentioned above would work, we do believe in the essential role of teachers at all education levels. For them to fulfill an optimal performance, the initial training of teachers under a rights approach is urgent. I paid very much attention to what it, and really, you know, it is true. The school can be an excellent experience of solidarity, democracy, of learning to live with the different ones, to appreciate each other. And yet that is lacking a lot because at least in Peru, teacher training is not really based on the human rights approach. It's very instrumental, as you were saying, Professor Moss. But things may be changing, because during this period, during this government, new curriculum for training has been approved, and it does have a human rights approach. We need to train our teachers really urgently. We do not believe in this training or capacity building courses of 1 month, perhaps sometimes even 2 weeks, to transform really what we want in taking care and educating our children. We do need the foundations and intentionality of education to be deeply rooted in each one of our teachers at whatever level they are working, as I say, but mainly at this very, very early stage of their lives. Of course, I think one of the most, the richest constitutions we have is a Children's Rights Convention, really. Every article of that convention is very, very important and should be part of every teacher's training, as I say. Because otherwise we are never going to have the quality of education, which by which we mean the pertinent education that a very complex and diverse world, not only a society, but the whole world, is really crossed by diversity. And to have diversity, something as a world richness and not a world problem and source of inequalities as it is right now. I think also if we have and we also have the very important concept of learning alongside our lives. What is long life learning? That's it. I have always felt that we could not consider early childhood creation without taking into account as well early learning along our lives. Especially for poor families that have had no schooling or very poor schooling, they have all the right that is not being served. They have the right for programs of life learning, right? And in the recent years, and this is a problem, it's a tragedy all across Latin America, early pregnancy. Early pregnancy is increasing in all our countries. And we can see how very young girls really have their lives almost without any opportunity to develop. And they also declare they feel very without arm, without instrument, without knowing what to do, how to raise their children in the way they would like them to raise. So I think that we have to have a very much more comprehensive concept of education, and lifelong learning for me is a very, very important one, because by that we mean that every human being, no matter its age, his race, his location where he lives or whatever, he has or she has the right to go on learning what he or she feels that is pertinent to make them to give them a better living. And of course, for all that, it is important, and I think that with that I'm going to finish. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madeleine, for your thoughts, your reflections, for telling us in detail the policies of early childhood care and education, how they've been rolling out in Peru, in the Peruvian context. Also, one of the issues that we face, not only with early childhood care and education, but other spheres and stages of education, which is and policy overall, which is the discontinuation of public policies, and what efforts really need to be put in place so that a certain vision of education, hopefully a rights-based vision, can actually persist and be the basis of policy making and educational practice. Thanks also for really putting center stage the issue of teachers and the role of the teachers and the extent to which it's so important that teacher training be in tune with this perspective of education as a human right, this perspective of education as as fundamentally being political, and the challenges that we have in order to ensure that teacher training is in the same page as this perspective of human rights and education as a political action. I would like to invite our last intervention, Vernon Munoz. He is the head of policy of the Global Campaign for Education. He is our discussant. So Werner, you have 10 minutes to share with us some comments regarding, based on what you've heard so far, and other thoughts that you have regarding early childhood care and education. Over to you, Werner.
Thank you, Camila. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. Un saludo muy cariñoso y solidario a nuestros colegas latinos que están siguiendo este debate. So I'm going to be very brief in order to give space for our panelists to respond and to comment. And you would probably have a lot of questions as well. So this, I have just a few notes that I have taken based on what our panelists have explained. So first of all, I very much agree with Peter's criticism on early childhood care and education as a model for human capital. In fact, this kind of utilitarian view of early childhood education, and in general, the utilitarian view of education, as Mercedes pointed out, has been largely criticized by several human rights bodies and mechanisms. So from the human rights point of view, just consider that education is an end in itself, rather than merely a means to achieving other ends. And it was Katarina Tomaszewski who brought up the attention around 20 years ago, something like that, on how some economists define education as a production of human capital and classify all human rights dimensions just as externalities, no? Something else around education. And well, 20 years later, we still see how the World Bank and many development agencies still consider people as human capital instead of subjects of rights. And this is not a minor issue. This is very serious because the very meaning of the right to education is put in question under the human rights, the human capital premise. So if we don't question the axiom, we could very easily get lost in this forest of wording that we receive constantly on these economicistic views. And we also we also have to take account of the existence of a model of global development that seeks to reduce the very diverse social and cultural phenomenon, such as education, to issues of mercantile efficiency or economic growth. And here comes a problematic dimension of the concept of development, which is now very much at the center of the public policies. And in fact, it seems that behind this concept of development, there is a kind of ideology that perceives education and development as economic factors that can be manipulated by planners. So this presupposes the idea that education is one thing and development is completely another thing. and then that kind of external professional body or agency, most of the time northern organizations and banks, have both the power and the right to organize the former in a functional relationship with the latter. And the question remains the same. What is development anyway? So just notice that if we follow the development model of the industrialized countries, the world will collapse in 1 week. So again, what is really at stake is the realization of human rights through education for all. So the utilitarian and authoritarian approach to education also reveals that the current education systems do not fit people's realities. Not even in the case of the few youngest children who enter the education system. Mercedes pointed out as well the fact that the right to play actually means the right to enjoy and to have fun, decrease while we transit the education system, and that only and this only confirms the dramatic role of obedience and absurd discipline education play in the market society. And finally, Madeleine reminds us that young children are right holders and human right to education should be gender sensitive. That is absolutely clear. What is not clear is how states are doubling their obligations as guarantors and providers that are attached to those rights and would lead us to the SD agenda accomplishment. This is not clear at all for me as well. We can see that the best interest of the child is well defined by the Human Rights International instruments, but in terms of practical application, it is always under the interpretation of those who have the power to decide. So again, under a restrictive and utilitarian view, the best interest of the child is usually seen as the potential capacity to become a good consumer. Early childhood is a social and historical construction that may vary from one context to the other. So there is also a kind of risk of having a patriarchal interpretation of what is important for early childhood. So those are my reflections, and I would love to hear what you think about them. And maybe there are some other questions from the audience. So thank you so much. Muchas gracias. And greetings from Costa Rica.
Thank you ever so much, Werner, for your reflections, for your comments to the three presentations. We are coming already to the end of our time, but before closing, I would like to share two questions that are one that has come from the audience, one that I would like to pose to the panelists, and then ask for the three, Peter Moss, Mercedes, and Madeleine, to please round up in 5 minutes and just, share your reflections in 5 minutes before we close. But also I would like to just let people know that we will take forward one of the suggestions that came through in the chat over here, that not only will we be subtitling the video of Peter Moss, but we will also be subtitling the entire panel as a whole, because all of this has been taped. It's all we have recorded this panel, so we will be subtitling it and sharing it in the channels of CLADI. So basically, there are two questions that I would like to pose. One of them comes from the audience, and it says, most of the panelists advocate for an intersectoral approach. However, early childhood care and education has abandoned the sector of health and nutrition approach. Is the early childhood development perspective over? This is the first question. And a question that I would like to pose for all of you is the following. Peter Moss has listed, he mentioned several resistance movements, very interesting. So we know that there is resistance to a reductionist, economicist model that comes from the academia. We also know that there are patterns of resistance and movements of resistance coming from civil society movements, such as the ones here present, CLADE and OMEP, and that national campaigns. So I would like to hear your reflections as to what can we do differently to make these resistance movements actually have more leverage in spaces of policy making. Particularly at the international level, what we see is there is still a lot of resistance, and really what prevails, unfortunately, is more of a reductionist perspective. So are there thoughts coming from you of how we can leverage more our resistance movements into the policy-making sphere? So who would like to start, please? Peter, would you like to start?
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Marvelous.
Okay, I'm going to take the second question because I think the issue about health and nutrition is a rather different one in more high income and affluent countries. And therefore, where my experience is, and therefore I don't feel competent to comment on that question in other countries. I think it wouldn't be appropriate. I think the question about how do we reach into the policymakers and the politicians who are completely have been sold this story of quality and high returns and so forth is very difficult, and I don't see an easy answer to it. I'm very struck by the advice of Milton Friedman, who I think those of you in Latin America will have had a lot of knowledge of, the godfather of neoliberalism, who talked about the need to be ready for when the crisis comes and to have alternatives and alternative ideas worked out. And I think those of us who want to contest the dominant story need to be continuing to work on developing alternative stories, and also working out what sort of policies are necessary for those alternative stories to be put into practice. And we need to be very practical. We need to say, this is the vision we have, and these are the conditions that we need to make it happen. On the other side, we also have to continue to be very critical of the dominant stories that are told to us, and of the work of organizations like the OECD with PISA and the International Early Learning Study, the PISA for 5-year-olds, which OECD is trying to develop. So we need to be both very critical, but also offering very clear alternatives of how and why early childhood education could be based on a different set of stories. Because it seems to me that we are at that moment of crisis. We've had the financial crisis of 2008. We've had the environmental crisis coming up stronger and stronger. And now we face this global pandemic. So everything that seems solid and taken for granted even 5 or 6 years ago now begins to seem open to question. And I think that therefore we are in this crisis situation, and we are facing possibilities, therefore, of actually introducing new arguments, new discussions, even, for example, new ideas about what the economy should be. So I would say that early childhood has a contribution to make to the economy. I don't dismiss that, but the question is, what economy? What sort of economy should early childhood be making a contribution to? And also in what other areas, like the social, the cultural, the political, should it be making a contribution? As well, as Werner said, the importance of education simply as a goal in itself. So I think we have to be ready for the crisis, which I think is now upon us, not only nationally, but globally. And we need to have very clear arguments now about how alternatives might look and how we might put them into practice.
Thank you so much, Professor Peter Moss. Would Madeleine like to take the floor?
Well, yes, I agree 100% with what Professor Moss has just said. The only way of substituting a model is by proving that other model works. So the great challenge for all civil society organizations is to produce these new stories he's talking about, to present experiences in very detailing all the conditions that make such experience a success. And the success, of course, should be not only in economic terms, on human understanding with each other terms, right? I really would like to underline that the last purpose of the intention of education should be a better world. A transformative education cannot accept the way that the majority of societies are conducting their lives and policies right now, because over and over in every country there are testimonies of great inequalities, great and injustice, unfair policies. Discrimination is deeply rooted in many of our societies, and they are the real great source of wars, civil wars, and in between country wars, and we are never going to have a better society if we go on with that kind of model and behavior. The fight for power and the fight for richness, I mean for monetary richness, is extremely high, and we have to find a way of undermining that feeling. And as I say, we do have, and I quite agree, we do have to present alternative, the conditions of that alternatives to work, the policies that are needed in order to have them succeed. Offer alternatives and the practical ways getting to them. I mean, to have them, to implement them at not a particular set, in a particular context, but can be proved in another environments and societies as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Madeleine, for your thoughts. I would like to call Mercedes for her final intervention and reflections. Please go ahead. Please go ahead, Mercedes. I think you're muted. Yeah, you're still muted.
Yes.
Okay.
Hello. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Camila. The first issue is that I want to answer one of these questions. I have emphasized the need for a coordinated and comprehensive approach in early childhood education and care. And all the time I said education and care, all the time, because they are inseparable. There is a large tradition of collaborative work between educators and pediatricians and people from the welfare. And we must overcome fragmentation and enrich these approaches. We believe that education is a great tool for the achievement of all human rights and to make possible and to enrich the development of early childhood. Much research has shown us that development is not possible without human relationships and mediated by culture. Otherwise, the Committee on the Right of the Child in the General Comment number 5 states the need to build integral policies. But now our concern, perhaps because of that, we need to be very clear in this. Our concern is that most of the last proposals are forgetting the right of education in early childhood, especially in the first 3 years. To answer the question that Camila posed, I have to say that at OMEP we are working in expanding and sharing a political and critical vision of early childhood education and care, as Peter Moss said. Advocacy work is multiple. We have to move on policies, on practices, on institutions. And for example, we are approaching state officials and parliamentarians to raising community awareness. We are expanding our networks with our other activists for the right to education. Because of that, we put in value our relation with the CLADE. We could strengthen strategies and learn a lot one from another. We are making efforts to enforce our message. Because of that, we have a communication plan that is beginning to develop in this last 3 months, funding in more research, sharing our knowledge about education for sustainable development from early childhood among educators, and in relation with the practices, we try to inspire that practices, to install what Peter Moss said, a critical view of the work, in order to build a democratic and open school founded on research, on reflection, on political clarity. And finally, I have to say that as established in the public declaration that of our last assembly in Panama, World Assembly in Panama, we said that we are committed to human rights, to the convention, and to justice for early childhood education. They had the right to enjoy their consecrated rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mercedes, for your final reflections that bring our virtual seminar to a closure. A few last words to thank very much CIS for the opportunity and making sure that this panel is possible, along with so many other panels of the CIS conference. So thank you ever so much for this fantastic effort in making this possible. Thank you also to OMEP and EDUCO for holding and organizing this conference in partnership with CLADE, with the Latin American Campaign for the Right to Education. Actually, we have posted in the chat the study that Mercedes mentioned that was carried out by CLADE, OMEP, and EDUCO, so please feel free to download it. And we received 2 other questions while we were in our final round of interventions. So we will make sure to send these to the 3 panelists. And when we do our summary of the session, we will ask our panelists to also reflect on the 2 questions that have arrived in at the very end. So we will be closing at the moment. It's been a pleasure to have you all with us this afternoon, this evening for some of you. And I hope that we can meet again, be it in face-to-face, be it virtually, so that we keep up the battle and for a better and more just world. Have a wonderful evening, all of you, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Professor
much. Thank you to all the
Vernon. Bye.
panelists.